Well, this is the very, very first piece of aircraft I ever came in contact with. As a little kid I used to play with this when I was at primary school. It lived in my granny's green wooden trunk, and sometimes I used to get it out and was allowed to play with it. But what happened was it was recovered by my mother and my brother, who went up the back of the house here to a crashed aircraft that had come down. And when they got to the site, there was some RAF guards guarding it, but they told them they could take any parts they wanted. And Mother ended up with this little part, which I've since found out where it fits in the cockpit of the aircraft and what it does. But the mystery is that particular aircraft. It's been a Wellington bomber that I'm sure of, but I can never find out from all the histories, the logs, the information, and all these hundreds and thousands of crashes that happened during the war. This particular one doesn't appear anywhere, and we can't find out anything about it. Yet I have a part here that's out of a Wellington bomber, recovered by my late mother and my brother. He was only a very small child at the time, and it still intrigues me as to what, why and how this aircraft came to being, but it did within a mile and a half from where we're sitting now. So this was my first introduction to wartime aircraft. And now this brings me on to the second part, which is this little boost gauge face for one of the engines. This I recovered myself as an 11-year-old schoolboy on my first trip out to the local Wellington bomber above Chopiat there. In 1959, this aircraft was virtually all complete, like a giant airfix kit sticking out of the hillside from when it had crashed in February 1943. And I picked a few little parts up, but this was the very, very first part I ever picked up or collected from a World War II aircraft. And this little thing led to a massive amount of items I have now in my museum, and this little face really started it all off. And then I got some land on in the field there. I'd it given by the farmer who was next door at the time, and I put a shed up there. It was about, I don't know, 15 foot by about 10. Another extension onto it and filled that, and then we built another extension and another and another and another. Just kept adding on and filling them up with aircraft parts till what it really is today, like. And it's still full, and I could do with expanding more, but I'm getting a bit limited now. This is a very, very rare dustbin gun turret. It's the only one of its type in the world now in existence. It was recovered back in the 1980s from a crashed Wellington bomber a few miles outside Braemar in Scotland. It was in very, very rough condition because it had hit the ground at 200 or 300 miles an hour, and I brought it back with a view just to displaying it in the museum. And then a friend of mine said they could form a little group down in Surrey with a view to doing a restoration back to the condition it's now in today. This restoration took the best part of 20 years, and there was over 40,000 man-hours went into restoring it. Now, most of the guys who restored the turret were either ex-RAF Bomber Command, or they had been fitters during and after the war working with metal, and their knowledge and expertise was absolutely invaluable in doing the fantastic job that you now see here today. And we brought it down with the help of the Braemar Mountain Rescue Team. Without their invaluable help, I couldn't have got it down because it weighs about 500 weight, and when it's 3,000 feet up on a mountain top, there's nowhere could that have been manhandled down by a small team. Well, it was lowered down from underneath on the Wellington bombers. It was wound down into the slipstream for use with the gunner inside it. Then when not in use, the whole thing was wound back up into the fuselage. But it was such a useless design that it slowed the aircraft down by a considerable number of miles per hour. And also it put the fuel consumption up of the aircraft in general. And the field of view and fire was so very poor that the whole thing was really obsolete by the time the war started. Well, this is a control column, which is very rare in its own right, but it was from a Bristol Blenheim bomber that crashed up on the Northern Pennines up Milton in Teesdale in 1938, before the war even started. We recovered this, along with most of the aircraft, back in the early 1980s. And eyewitnesses on the ground at the time said that the aircraft flew up the valley in fog, and it got to the head of the valley, and the pilot realised he was going to collide with the hill, so he banked hard to port, which is left, to try and avoid the hill. But unfortunately, the port wind clipped the top of the hill, and the aircraft cartwheeled in and killed him and his two fellow colleagues. And this control column now is locked hard to left or port in that position, and that was the last act of the brave pilot trying to save himself and the crew, but unfortunately it didn't work. This is a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, recovered again many years ago in the 1980s from a crashed Spitfire. This particular Spitfire crashed in the banks of the River Leven, just outside Yarm. It was involved in a training flight with another Spitfire at the time. This was back in December 1940, and the other Spitfire was the commanding officer of 54 Squadron, RAF Catterick, and his name was Flight Lieutenant Alan Deer, a very famous Battle of Britain fighter pilot and one of the top scoring pilots in the Battle of Britain. On this particular day, Alan Deer and the other pilot, Sergeant Howard Squire, were doing a training exercise, and Howard Squire got a bit too over-exuberant and came in too quick, too fast, and collided in mid-air at 12,000 feet with Alan Deer. Now, Howard Squire got out of his aircraft no problem at 12,000 feet and never saw his aircraft again, and often wondered what had happened to it. And just by sheer luck, we made contact with Howard Squire, and he arranged to come up on the day of the recovery of his Spitfire. We took him back to the River Leven and showed him the site, and he couldn't believe that great big parts of his aircraft were still surviving all those years later. He was also very relieved that his aircraft hadn't done any damage on the ground to property or killed anyone, and for all those years he'd been very worried about what had happened to his old Spitfire. And when we told him that it had crashed harmlessly in the banks of the River Leven, it was a great relief to him. You know, we gave him a few souvenirs from his old Spitfire, and he went back to Birmingham a very happy man. This is a propeller blade from a German Messerschmitt 110. It was recovered from a crash site somewhere in Russia. I don't have any more history than that of it, but I acquired it from a chap in a swap deal who was getting parts out of Russia. And if you notice on the top here, there's some writing which I'm afraid is upside down to us now, but for many years I wondered what the writing was. And one day a few years back I had a chap looking around the museum, and I pointed this out to him. He says, "Oh, it's your lucky day." He says, "I'm a Russian teacher at a university." So he translated the writing, and it is actually people's names who must have been to the crash site over the years and inscribed their names on the propeller blade.
Bandits, 5 o'clock. Got him in my sights, Lieutenant. High, Daddy, see him? 2 more, 12 o'clock high, coming fast.
Well, this is a .5 or half-inch Browning machine gun, American-made, widely used in World War II and still widely used today. This was recovered from a B-17 Flying Fortress that crashed on the top of the Cheviot Hills in 1944. We found this literally by accident, sticking out of the peat. A friend of mine was walking across the hill, hit his toe on something very hard and stumbled, and when he looked down, about 6 inches of the front of the barrel, the muzzle, was sticking out of the ground. So we got the spades and dug down and round it, and the old gun came out. And we also found quite a lot of ammunition, which from the same wreck, which I must point out has been deactivated and made safe, as is the gun, has got a safe deactivation permit. But these were recovered back in about 1970 something, can't remember the exact year, but it was a nice find from an American wartime bomber. This is a very, very rare, genuine Lancaster Pilot's main instrument panel. It's not a reproduction one, there's quite a few of those about, but this was actually taken out of a Lancaster at the end of the war that was being scrapped. A chap took it for a souvenir. Well, this is a very, very rare propeller blade. It's from a Lancaster bomber, but not just any old Lancaster. It was recovered from one of the Lancasters that took part in the famous Dambusters raid. And this is from Pilot Officer Otley's aircraft, which crashed near Hamm in Germany. Unfortunately, when it crashed, he still had the bouncing bomb on board, and all bar and the rear gunner were killed in the ensuing crash. Well, this is a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. It's a complete Lancaster bomber power plant. It's not a crashed one, same as the ones we looked at before. This engine would run again, no problem, but I don't intend running it. I say it is a complete Lancaster power plant. It came with the oil coolers and the cells, intakes, everything. But I've had to take most of the panels off, the external engine cowls, otherwise you couldn't see what the engine looks like. But it took me over 40 years to get a good Merlin, and to get a Lancaster one as well, being my favourite aircraft. That was just the icing on the cake for me. I would like to get another one, but now, unfortunately, a really good engine now, a Rolls-Royce engine with very low hours on them, it cost £100,000, which puts it out of the markets for people like me. I didn't pay that for this one, obviously, but I got it at a bargain price, and I'm really, really happy with it. Well, here we have an instrument panel that is from a Junkers 88 German aircraft from World War II. But there's a very interesting story behind this panel, because back in 1944 this particular aircraft was on a mission over England, and it was a very dark, foggy night, and they got lost, but they thought they were back over occupied Europe, and would put down on one of the bases there because they were very low on fuel. So they came into land at what they thought was occupied Europe, taxied the aircraft up and got out, only to be met by a group of RAF personnel who in turn thought it was one of their aircraft returning from a night raid. And you can imagine the look on the faces of both the RAF personnel and the German aircrew, because nobody knew what to do. There was a kind of standoff. The German crew jumped out, but they couldn't do nothing because they were out of fuel, so they were taken prisoner. And the aircraft was taken for evaluation by the RAF and flown for quite a while. Well, all the items you see here in the museum isn't exactly what I have got. I have a load more down at Anthony's farm down near Teesside Airport.